Welcome to the September meeting of the Society of Antiquaries of Newcastle. Dr. Christina Cowart-Smith specialises in the history and archaeology of early medieval Britain, focusing in particular on stone sculpture. Since 2017, she's been involved in the massive corpus of Anglo-Saxon stone sculpture at Durham, and for the past 8 seasons, Christina has been excavating with the Durham University Dig Ventures team on Lindisfarne. Please welcome Christina, please.
Good evening. I'm delighted to join you in person tonight, having recently come from the trenches of Lindisfarne. Tomorrow we finish up our last day of a 3-week excavation. This is our 9th year on the island, working as a Durham University team alongside our collaborators from Dig Ventures. Next year marks our 10th and final season under the direction of Dr. David Petz, Associate Professor in Archaeology and one of my 2 PhD supervisors. I had the good fortune of also being supervised by Professor Sarah Semple, whom I know spoke to the Society in late June about her work at Yeavering. Also to note, if you want to come up and see what's going on, mark your calendars for September 2025. We'll be on Lindisfarne for nearly the whole month, and it will be our last season of excavation. There's still so much lying in sanctuary close, but it's time now to write it up and get all finds and human remains processed. After analysis, the remains themselves will be returned to the earth, where they've always belonged. Tonight's lecture focuses on the early medieval sculpture associated with Holy Island, Northumberland. It pays particular attention to the high crosses produced on island, situating them in a wider northern Northumbrian context. This is the first time that sculpture has been found in properly recorded excavation on island, and the significance of this can't be overstated. Excitingly, I also get to reveal a sculpture piece that came up the past weekend, but hasn't yet been released on social media. But you'll just have to wait about 40 minutes for the big reveal. Lindisfarne looms large on the historical stage, and for obvious reasons. It was, of course, the site of a famous and well-endowed early medieval monastery founded by Aidan and Oswald in AD 635. Its monks and bishops advised kings. Its clergy, like those at other northern Northumbrian sites, traveled far and wide, forming political and social alliances as much as they did ecclesiastical ones. It was likewise home to the Lindisfarne Gospels, one of the most famous extant gospel books of early medieval Europe. Many more manuscripts would have been produced and associated with this island. What we have, evidently a faint reflection of what was. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle tells us that in AD 793, quote, the woeful inroads of heathen men destroyed God's church on Lindisfarne Island by fierce robbery and slaughter, end quote. To this, Simeon of Durham later adds that, quote, they trod the holy things under their polluted feet. They dug down the altars and plundered all of the treasures of the church. Some of the brethren they slew, some they carried off with them in chains. The greater number they stripped naked, insulted, and cast out of doors, and some they drowned in the sea, end quote. Visceral, dramatic, violent. While we must heed these references, neither is actually contemporary to the events described. As accounts, they are perhaps more of a reflection of their writer's agenda than anything else. We do, however, know that from 793 on, coastal monasteries in Britain would experience successive raids. Iona in 795, 802, 806, and 825. Lindisfarne was repeatedly attacked as well. But why would the Vikings have kept going back to Iona, like Lindisfarne, if there wasn't something to go back for? Clearly a community was hanging on. By 854, the Historia Regnum Anglorum details the substantial landholdings of the community of Cuthbert, including dependencies up and down the North Sea coast. Oldham, Abercorn, Coldingham, Edinburgh, Jedburgh, Melrose, Norham, Tyningham. All are sculpture-producing sites, and all but one gives us extant high crosses. The extent of these landholdings does not reflect a community cowering from Viking dominance. In AD 875, as we all know, the community of Cuthbert is said to have left Holy Island, carrying with them the body of their saint and a piece of sculpture, a standing cross. Simeon again tells us that this cross, dedicated to Bishop Ethelwald, had stood on the island through the raids. He says that it was broken and rejoined by pouring lead into its cracks. Most of us will be familiar with this story, the monks of the community of Cuthbert traveling to Norham, Chesterley Street, and finally Durham, where our magnificent cathedral holds its shrine to St. Cuthbert. Yet, some of the community undoubtedly left, Lindisfarne's textual record falls silent by about the mid-9th century. But we know that life carries on. Our trenches sing it loud and clear each and every year we dig out on Holy Island. This lecture is about sculptures, so I'll keep my overview of our excavation to the basics. Our trenches have predominantly clustered to the east of the priory in a field called Sanctuary Close. If you've been out to Holy Island, you'll know this is the field that you can stand in and look out to Lindisfarne Castle. Your back to the priory, your left side to the Crown and Anchor pub, and your right side to the Heuch, that rocky Winsel promontory upon which the war memorial sits, or usually sits when it isn't blown down. It's currently laying in fragments on the ground. And for the second time. Until the 19th century, the harbor would have come much further up. And this year we placed a trench right next to what would have been the slope down to it. That's delineated by that red circle. We have unearthed sculpture in nearly every trench we've opened, and every single trench, bar one, has turned up human remains. This includes the trench closest to what would have been the early medieval harbor, the one that I just pointed out. It seems Sanctuary Close is littered with graves cutting into graves. Hundreds, if not thousands, of individuals are buried beneath its well-plowed surface. Men, women, and children whose remains date to the late 8th through to the early 11th centuries. People who lived or came to this island in life, or whose bodies were brought in after death, before, during, and after that infamous 793 attack. Most individuals are interred in supine position, lying on their backs, their hands are clasped at their pelvis, evidence of a burial shroud now long gone. But this year, we've also excavated some interesting prone burials. Obviously, that means the individual is lying on their chest, and row burials. The latter are probably some of our earliest burials on site, but check back when we get the C14 dates from the lab. The graves are filled with white quartz pebbles. We find hundreds and thousands of them. We find a similar tradition at sites on the Isle of Man and in Ireland, particularly those places associated with early medieval pilgrimage. Since 2022, we've settled on an area of unusual burial, what we'll call our focal burials. On the left side image, you'll see two burials, one marked chest burial and the other marked shrine burial, ? Both are composed of multiple burials, one on top of the other. Chest burials refer to the interment of an individual or individuals within a repurposed domestic chest. Though the wood of the chest is long gone, we found the lock plate of the chest, which is also in that inset image. Wonderfully, some wood is still attached to it and is currently being analyzed at Durham Uni. Next to it lies what I've called the, quote, shrine burial. Unlike any of our other kist burials, it stands out for the standing stones, which seem to delineate its cardinal points above ground. I know it's hard to see in this image, but trust me on that. Thrillingly, there's not just one, but multiple burials interred within, including an infant at the top. The central burial is that of a woman. Her remains have been C14 dated with 90% probability from 771 to 978 AD. Even more excitingly, when we got down to her burial a couple of years back, the student excavating it found what appeared to be stray pieces of someone's jumper in the trench after lunchtime. This actually turned out to be gold threads. Found at the woman's head, they likely made up a headpiece. She was clearly of high status, and people seem to have wanted to be buried in proximity to her. This is furthered by the presence of a paved surface nearby. Again, see the image on the right. A fragment of porphyry was found in proximity of the type which make up Irish portable altars. And, perhaps most importantly of all, a definite concentration of neonatal and children's remains are found scattered around these burials. People seem to be intentionally burying their babies near to whoever this woman was and her earthly remains. Is this high status holy woman a saint? We know that chest burials, like that next to the shrine burial, allowed for easy access to bones after death. In all, we are at present trying to determine the nature of our Sanctuary Close cemetery. It's clearly a lay cemetery owing to the presence of women and children. Some of our burials have interesting ailments, including, for example, a rare example of cancer in the osteoarchaeological record. I can think of only a few examples of blunt trauma, for example, an object taken to the head with force. So are these people from the island itself, or did they work the lands of the monastery? Were they related? And if so, it would seem they were more local. Conversely, did they travel from further afield? Did they come to Medcaut, that Brittonic name for Lindisfarne, which speaks to it being an island of healing, as much for medical help as spiritual aid? We presume that it's a combination of both. that we have the remains of a local community and individuals coming from further afield, either in life or death. At nearby Bamborough, with its own early medieval cemetery, Post-X has revealed individuals buried there who came from the west of Scotland, Scandinavia, and even the Mediterranean. As of this morning, we've lifted 85 burials, 20 of which were lifted just this season. It's a mammoth undertaking to process all of them. So along with funding considerations, this goes towards explaining why the excavation needs to come to a close and things need to be written up. Before I move on to the sculpture, I thought I'd give you a taster of the small finds. They and the excavation at large are deserving of their own lecture, but that's for another night. On this slide, you can see coins, a bone comb with runic inscription, and a finger bone with 2 rings still affixed to it. I took that photo before it was pulled out of the ground. You can see that the finger bone and the rings are both turquoise hued. The copper rings have oxidized, turning themselves and the bone that color. The beautiful sea blue game piece in the center of the screen is the king piece of a game called Nefeltoffel. Known in the wider North Sea world, the pieces are rare. Another example is from the Pictish Hill Fort at Dundurn in Perth and Kinross. And here's a photo of that example next to our Lindisfarne fragment, the Lindisfarne fragment being on the right, or fragment rather, the whole piece. We actually found another small fragment of another Nefeltoffel king piece in our first few days of excavation this year. It's nowhere near as complete, but nevertheless shows that Holy Island of the 9th and 10th centuries was vibrant and active. Games speak of leisure time, of connections, trade, and exchange. Lindisfarne continued to have all of this in the post-793 period. Let's turn to the sculpture. If you've been out to Holy Island in the last year, you'll have experienced the recent redisplay of the sculptures in the Priory Museum. Now you can actually circumambulate the high cross fragments. Likewise, the namestones can be viewed from most angles through the glass case they now inhabit. These obviously are the freestanding cruciform stone sculptures, the high crosses, and then you can see the namestones in their case. A number of early medieval sculpture fragments had been located on Holy Island by the early 20th century. Most of these had presumably come to light during 2 phases of clearance work in the late 19th century. None, however, is given a clear find spot, even when one returns to carefully mine the antiquarian sources. This crossed shaft fragment was found on the grounds of the priory, quote, sometime before 1893, and it's mentioned, that's the first year in which it's mentioned in a Hodges publication. This near complete namestone is said to have been found in February 1915 during clearances in the north transept of the priory. Even this off-sided figural fragment is completely decontextualized, first mentioned in 1924, but with no known find spot. The namestone circled here is also said to have been found in 1924 on the shore at the southeast corner of St. Cuthbert's Island. This lovely zoomorphic interlaced cross-shaft fragment was also presumably found sometime before 1924, as again, it's then that it's first mentioned in publication. Why 1924? Architect turned archaeologist Charles R. Peers had teams digging on Lindisfarne and Whitby in the interwar years, though it's questionable whether he ever went to visit Lindisfarne during the excavations there. His publications seen here offer nothing really in the way of contextualizing the sculptures. Most of the time, it's unclear which fragments actually come from excavation and which are just surface finds. Moreover, neither Brian Hope Taylor's brief excavation on Holy Island in 1962, nor Deirdre O'Sullivan and Rob Young's work in the 80s turned up any sculpture, even though the latter, that is the Leicester Uni excavations, importantly revealed evidence of 10th century agriculture on the north side of the island. Sorry. It's a bit frozen. Maybe I pressed too many things at the same time. Sorry. Ah, excellent. I think it skipped one of my slides, but that's okay. There's one between it. Yeah. Oh, okay. Maybe I took it out. Okay, we'll keep going. It's okay, we'll go to the next slide, yeah. Yes, excellent. Let me just go ahead really quickly. Okay, apparently in this version I don't have, there's a picture I wanted to show you of a cross space you might be familiar with that has kind of, it looks a bit like a piece of cloth that's draped over the base. Anyway, I wanted to explain it. Basically, it and its another cross base that were found were apparently found underneath the northwest pier of the Priory Church. And there's, according to peers, there is currently still a cross base underneath the northwest pier of the Priory Church. But it's hard to see in 20th century photographs, so it's just as well we can't see it on the screen. Right. I've gone through these sculptures from Holy Island because I want to emphasize their lack of archaeological context. This fits in regionally. About 63% of all extant high cross fragments are contextually useless, as harsh as that sounds. They are not built into a datable structure, for example, reused in church masonry, nor do they even have any sort of monument biography. And this is just to give you a sense of the find spot contexts of high cross fragments in County Durham and Northumberland. There we go. Indeed, relatively few early medieval sculpture fragments in Britain have been found in excavation. I produced these graphics during my PhD. While the focus is on high crosses, not other sculpture types, high crosses are by far the most numerous monument in central Britain. For context, there are approximately 2,000 fragments of high crosses surviving across Britain. By this, I'm defining a high cross as a freestanding, monumental, cruciform stone sculpture, which usually stands between 1.5 to 3 meters in height. Only a fraction of these monuments have been found in excavation. And I hope you can see there some of those sites. Note too the dearth of excavated high cross fragments across northern Britain, aka Scotland, which can explain a lot about our lack of knowledge for some of the material. Here is a closer look at all high cross producing sites in central Britain. And again, it's showing where excavated components have been found, circled in blue. Again, more than one component could have been found at a site for it to be circled in blue, vis-a-vis all sites that have high cross components. Again, just to prove the point that there are so few monuments found in excavation. As a result, as I said, our excavation is the first to properly record the find spots of Lindisfarne's early medieval sculpture, high crosses included. Most of our sculpture is found in rubbly upper layers, crushed and moved about during centuries of plowing. Our most common sculpture finds are so-called namestones. We've nearly doubled the count known from Lindisfarne prior to our excavation. On Lindisfarne, namestones take the shape of a small round-top slab. They are our earliest form of early medieval sculpture on the island, dated epigraphically to around the first quarter to first half of the 8th century. The term comes from the fact that the monuments contain an inscribed name, presumably of the deceased. Inscriptions are usually in Old English, though sometimes runes. There's special finds in the sculpture record, as it's rare we get any sort of individual names on early medieval monuments. Namestones are also unique to northern Northumbria, to sites like Hartlepool Hart and Billingham. The Lindisfarne namestones are not only the largest, but most stylistically diverse namestone assemblage in Britain. Names are bounded by an incised or relief central cross, which itself creates 4 quadrants. The inscription is laid out in these quadrants, sometimes, but not always, by syllable. And interestingly, in this new example unearthed just last week, you can see that one of the quadrants, the bottom right, has been left blank. And this is unusual in the wider corpus of this material. This is before it was brushed and kind of cleaned. The monuments aren't cleaned entirely because they'll be sent to Durham for analysis of their possible pigment, which I'll talk about in a moment. The namestone that I just showed you also calls to mind another interlaced bordered namestone found a few years ago. It was on the title page of this slideshow. Like many high crosses, these little sculptures were multimedia objects. Some would have been painted in earthen pigments. This namestone, commemorating a certain Ithfrith, calls to mind crosses in manuscripts. In faintly incised lines, you can just make out an alpha and sideways omega. There we go, sideways omega. It's hard to see, I'm sure, in that screen. They're to the left and right of the top roundel of that central crosshead. The 8th century Galasian sacramentary, with its own roundel punctuated standing cross, also has an alpha and omega, this time hanging from the cross arms. It likewise sits within an arched space, an architectural closure of sorts, mimicking the canon tables of medieval manuscripts. Manuscript correlates exist for many of the namestones, as the springing of the interlaced curve on this little newly found fragment evokes a regula St. Benedict from Tegernsee in Bavaria. And here's a newly discovered, very small namestone with a deeply incised central roundel. It was found just a few days ago and has the runic inscription Cuthwolf in the top 2 quadrants. The deeply set, recessed roundel in its center probably held a glass or metal inset, or perhaps even a relic. Critically, some of the newly excavated namestones evidence aspects of the production of these little monuments. See here a fragment with the second personal name element Enwulf. Held in the right light, you can make out 2 parallel incised lines, which I've denoted with red arrows. Perhaps these acted like the pricking and ruling in early medieval manuscripts, preparing the page for additional text, or rather the stone surface, either carved or painted, that is the additional text. It does very much seem that the inscription is added last of all to these little namestones. The central cross goes first, then the border, then the inscription, and the more namestones we find are fitting into this pattern. These and other cross objects were part of a cross-rich world on Holy Island. Artifacts like the Rupertus cross, a wooden processional cross covered in gilded bronze, remind us of how much we've lost on Lindisfarne. Our island would surely have had its own Rupertus cross, or a few. High crosses were those most monumental of cross objects. Again, I define a high cross as a monumental, freestanding, cruciform stone sculpture. I'm cognizant I'm using a term coined to describe the Irish monuments, but I can think of no better adjective to encapsulate the body-sized or taller nature of these monuments. Occasionally we get skeuomorphs, that is, representations of high crosses in other media or monument types. Here's 2 fragments found in separate seasons of excavation. Somewhat miraculously, one was found in one season of excavation, and then we returned the next year, and the other fragment was being used to hold down the side of a tarp. And someone turned it over, and it revealed the rest of the composition. You can't make it up. Put together, they form a Golgotha composition, a central, larger cross flanked by 2 crosslets. Golgotha compositions are more common in the west of Britain than they are on this coast. They evoke the Passion narrative, whereby Christ was crucified with a man on either side. It's that narrative of the good thief versus the bad thief. Here I'll note that the central cross has a slight bulge where the cross head meets its shaft. I think this evokes the so-called collared crosses, high crosses of 9th century Britain. And that's an example on the right-hand side of the Golgotha stone from Whithorn in Dumfries and Galloway, a nice Western parallel, though I think ours is slightly more finely hewn. Likewise, the flanking crosses are thoughtfully delicate in this Golgotha composition, as you can see even in this weathered state. The cross to the left has rounded armpits, while the one on the right are more squared. Again, I think this is a conscious choice on the part of the sculptor to insert the world of the present, that is the world of high crosses, into the world of the biblical past. Crosses are always temporally compressing signs, and the Lindisfarne Golgotha stone is no exception. This brings us to Lindisfarne's collection of high crosses. As you can see from this graphic, Holy Island gives us the largest assemblage of high crosses in northern England. Excitingly, our excavations have only added to the tally. And last week we had a really big find to add to this tally. I keep just hinting at it. This brings us to Lindisfarne's, chronologically, most if not all of Lindisfarne's extant high crosses can be situated from the 9th century on. On sculpture grounds alone, we can't see that 793 date. That is without any of the excavated evidence. Again, the sculpture sings loud and clear that there's this uptick, this increase in tempo of high cross production in the 9th century. In 2021, we turned up this roughed out crosshead, its deeply set armpits calling to mind 10th century examples at Warkworth and Woodhorn, not far from Holy Island on the Northumbrian mainland. It was like the namestones found in rubbly layers. And the pink circle here denotes what I think is the pecked outline of a possible kind of boss. Again, this is roughed out. We have examples of roughed out cross components across Britain. I can think of one at Bewcastle, a roughed out cross shaft. So it's somewhat rare, but there are examples. And again, we got excited by this find. So you can only imagine the excitement that comes when we found some other things. It looks like, oh, sorry, Hilbert just left a message. Can they still see the PowerPoint? Okay, sorry, want to make sure, it seemed like maybe you couldn't. So we obviously thought that it was exciting to find the roughed out crosshead that I just showed you. So you can imagine our thrill at this little cross shaft fragment that came up out of the ground the same year. It has a single incised line on one face and a double incised line on the other. Parallels abound, as this slide reflects. Quote, simple cross components like this are notoriously hard to stylistically date. Sometimes they're given an earlier date because it's viewed that style progresses from simple things to more complex things, but as we know, as in life, it's never that easy. So some dates for these, quote, simple components are early, others are later. I think on the grounds of this particular monument and its context, we're looking at possibly a late 8th century little piece. It's not out with possibility that the borders that we can see here preserved in just that little fragment housed relief carving, maybe even figural sculpture. See this cross-shaft fragment from Aberlady in East Lothian, just along the Firth of Forth. I also show this example because it has tin inlay in the eyes of the figural sculpture. See that winged figure, that angel, and you can see the eye, the drilled eye sockets. Again, this is evidence for glass or metal insets, according with that discussion we had of namestones. And if you're interested in learning more about this monument and the tin inlay in it and for parallels across Britain, I recommend reading Alice Blackwell's article about it from the National Museum of Scotland in Edinburgh. So now we come to the big reveal, as promised. I know it's taken us about 50 slides to get there, but good things come to those who wait. It's not yet been released on social media, so you're a lucky bunch. Can anyone guess what this is? It's the arm of a standing cross. It's a cross arm. You can make out the double cusp, and I'll have some better pictures later. This is a model by photogrammetry that was very kindly taken by Nat Jackson. Also note, for the ship enthusiast, the maritime enthusiast, or the burial enthusiast, that this cross arm was found in proximity to a grave which has clench nails. Again, clench bolts are evidence of not necessarily of a ship burial, but rather of timber being repurposed in a burial context. This is our first example of this on Holy Island, and it would be one of the most northernmost examples of it. I know the phenomenon is concentrated in Kent, in East Anglia, and there are examples at Jarrow and York, but we were thrilled to bits when we got examples of clench nails in a burial just last week. So as I said, it's a lateral cross arm. It's the side of a high cross. It was found on Saturday, the day after I left site. It never fails. I'm especially grateful to Nat Jackson for these and the other models. The piece had been incorporated into an internal wall of a Norman lime kiln, one that we'd been digging for a number of years, but had closed up this year, thinking that we'd, quote, learned all we needed to from it. We will come back to the lime kiln context in a moment. Here are some photos taken of the fragment after it was masterfully cleaned for 5 hours by Edwin in the fines room. Edwin really has the patience of Job. The lateral arm measures 45 centimeters across, about 1.5 feet. It is double cusped in profile, something we see on Northumbrian high crosses from the 8th century onwards. But I think that in conjunction with the relief carving, we're looking at something that more comfortably sits in the 9th century. There is a bird on one broad face, that's the left-hand image, below a serpentine-like interlace cluster. So we have the bird here. Be not afraid, there are better images coming. Bird here, and then that kind of serpentine-esque interlace cluster. The other broad face, that is your right-hand image, has what seems to be zoomorphic interlace. So you have this kind of circle through which there's this writhing body, and then if you look at it closer up again, hopefully you can see this on Zoom, there's some sort of kind of head, open, gaping mouthed animal. But that side is much harder to make out overall. Here's a better image which really brings out that beautiful bird. It wouldn't be surprising if the other lateral arm also had a bird, as paired birds are known from other surviving cross heads, especially in the south of Northumbria. See here these two examples from Cropthorne and Catterick. Or this example from a Ripon crosshead, that is Ripon 3, according to the corpus of Anglo-Saxon stone sculpture. This crosshead in particular, Lang was convinced was a copy of that Catterick monument seen on the previous slide. Though our bird doesn't have the drilled eye of the Ripon one, again, drilled eye always makes one think perhaps inset. Obviously, you need some evidence for tin inlay. We do get the same spread of the wings and the distinctive displayed tail. The iconography of birds, peacocks, doves, etc., is rich. They often appear in scenes of the fountain of life, representing Christ, baptism, and in the case of peacocks, resurrection. Ernst Kitzinger has written about the appearance of paired birds on early medieval sarcophagi from Italy. For example, the sarcophagus of Theodora from the early 8th century. On a late 8th or early 9th century relief slab from Wensley, North Yorkshire, we also see confronted birds, each a mirror of each other, and they're up here. They occupy the space above the lateral cross arms. Again, emphasis on the lateral cross arms. They also have wedge-shaped tails and long pointed wings, which edge upwards, kind of they're arching their backs, and their necks are laid along their backs. So in the days to come, we'll continue to unpack the rich iconography of this cross. And myself and the team welcome any thoughts or comparisons that you might have. I'm especially taken with the interlace on the narrow face. I'm interested in the moment at the side viewing of these monuments and what gets carved onto narrow faces rather than just the broad faces. Here, I'll also go back to the fragment's fine spot, its reuse in the wall of the Norman lime kiln. I think we're seeing yet another example of Norman iconoclasm, something Deirdre O'Sullivan has written about. For example, her outstanding 2011 medieval archaeology paper called Normanizing the North. There certainly seems to be focused damage targeted at the center of the crosshead. You can see it here, and if I go back, you can see it here. So there's focused damage targeted at the center of the crosshead, that kind of boss area. This isn't unusual. Many crossheads across Britain bear these marks of defacement. Again, iconoclasm would be its own lecture. But possibly there was a discussion about the fact that obviously for a lime kiln, you need to burn things. Perhaps this was almost a chopping block for wood. Again, we'll need to kind of unpack a little bit more as to the fragments' relationships to the lime kiln. There was an example from Rothbury that was just mentioned today by someone else, where you see a reused cross component in a lime kiln. So overall, a lot of questions to ask about the reuse of this monument. And stay tuned on that. So let's go back to our chronological distribution, where we can add in our 3 new high cross components. Again, it just keeps getting better. So who knows what we'll find next year, maybe on that last day of the excavation. So this brings us to a question. How do the archaeological contexts of Lindisfarne's high crosses help us think about the original use of the monuments? What do these monuments do at a multifocal site like Lindisfarne, a site where there is a large assemblage of this material made through time and populating the island? I'd like to first state here that across Britain, we have no evidence archaeologically or textually that high crosses served as burial markers in the early medieval world. Here I bring up one of the namestones again. Namestones are often wrongly called grave markers. We don't actually have archaeological proof as of yet that they function in this way. The closest we've got was this namestone fragment, found somewhat falling into the kist lining of that focal grave that I mentioned. But we can't say that this monument relates to that specific person. Again, this is the shrine burial, the burial whose primary grave was that of the woman with gold at her head. But again, we can say they're in a broadly funerary kind of mixed up, jumbled context in the plowed up layers of the soil, usually, apart from this example. But again, they can't be associated at any site with the definite remains of a certain individual. So the term namestone allows us to kind of refrain from applying a function to them in some ways. High crosses are likewise sometimes ascribed a burial marker function. Almost as bad to my mind as the reductive preaching cross label. This drawing is of a very fragmented high cross from Cherry Hinton in Cambridgeshire, the only cross component known to have been found in excavation in East Anglia. The 1999 excavations at Church End, predating the construction of a housing development at the site, produced a smashed crosshead in 5 pieces. This had been used as the infill of a large square post supporting the southwest corner of a small building in St. Andrew's Churchyard. The building was probably a small rectangular church. Another fragment of this cross was deliberately placed behind the skull of a burial 5 meters southeast of the southeast corner of the suggested timber church. A third fragment was found in the fill of a pit within the graveyard area, which also contained a late Saxon or Norman potsherd and animal bone. But this in no way means that the monument or others associated with the Barnet quarry were burial markers. I know that this goes against what Stocker and Everson argue in a wider discussion on the circumstantial evidence for merchant patrons. High cross fragments were routinely brought into churchyards for safekeeping and storage, as the Bakewell assemblage most resoundingly attests. On Lindisfarne's Schiff, in fact, the Peregrini and National Lottery funded excavation in 2018 unearthed a cross shaft fragment found in an early medieval grave. And you can see it in the Priory Museum. It's this lovely small fragment of interlace. But this sort of early reuse is far more common than was previously thought. One of the chapters in my PhD was looking at reuse through time of cross components. And I should say that my PhD was a transnational study of high crosses. So it was looking at the monument form as a shared tradition amongst peoples in what is today England, Scotland, and Wales. It defies those national boundaries that we put on or can put onto things. The textual record likewise doesn't back up a burial or even funerary association for the monuments. Though we only get tantalizing glimpses as to the function and role of standing crosses, of all media, not just stone, in insular texts, none of the references indicates burial or funerary context. In the Vita Columbae, Adovnan says that the crosses were erected on Iona in 3 places. The first, a cross, quote, raised before the door of the kiln at the spot where Columba's venerable uncle Ernan, quote, breathed his last as he fell to the ground. A second cross is said to have been erected where Columba resided at the time of his death. Adovnan even says that it's standing at the time when he, Adovnan, writes. In both cases, standing crosses of uncertain medium mark the spot where holy men breathed their last. Ernan's death spot is especially significant because it was a fulfillment of Columba's prophecy that he would not see him again. In this way, the purpose of that cross might be read more as marking the spot where a prophecy was fulfilled rather than a place of death. A third and final cross is said to have been erected on Iona at a spot at which Columba rested. Fixed to a millstone on the roadside, one wonders if this millstone had indentations of the sort seen on the turning stones known from Iona. Fast forward in time and space, and Bede's Vita Cuthberti speaks of Cuthbert asking his Lindisfarne monks to bury him near his oratory, quote, on the eastern side of the Holy Cross I have erected there. The cross predates the burial spot and, like references to standing crosses in the Vita Guthlaki, stands in proximity to a dwelling. The 8th century Hodiaporicon of St. Willibald states that a cross stands on the estate of that saint's father. I won't go into details, but it's only in the 12th century that we seem to see standing crosses routinely associated with burial locations. I'm thinking of the writings of Simeon of Durham, William of Malmesbury, etc. In all, insular texts emphasize that standing crosses are erected at the site of events, where a holy person rested, where a holy person lived and died, where a prayer was made that came to fruition, or where an event occurred. The focus is on the site at which the cross is erected, the human dimension of the actions that took place there, this event, this place, this time. The cross erected at these places stands as witness to a human scale moment, something accomplished or realized here, and yet simultaneously points to something which transcends that. The use of standing crosses in this way can be linked back to Ionian monks. In Adovnan's version of De Locis Sanctis, crosses are said to have been erected in the Holy Land at sites delineating specific moments in Christ's life. For example, Adovnan recounts Arculf's memory that at the spot where Christ was baptized along the shores of the River Jordan, quote, a tall wooden cross was implanted. He goes on to say that this cross was covered in water at various times of the year, changing its location in relation to the shore and the way in which it was approached. The tidal nature of this description is particularly apt for thinking about sites like Lindisfarne. It also helps us think more carefully about monuments in their landscape environs, their animacy, their changeability. So this brings me back to Holy Island, to the sheer number and diversity of crosses we find here. Lindisfarne is a reminder, above all, that the monument type defies easy categorization. The massive cross space, the petting stone, that is your left-hand image with David Petts, known locally as the petting stone. It's on island, the stone that brides leap over after they get married. That stone, that cross base, stands on axis between St. Mary's Church and the Priory, which you can see in the image behind. And so it undoubtedly in the early medieval world as well would have stood on a threshold of built environs, again, in the past as it does today. We know from the Irish sources that monuments of this kind were circumambulated and central to liturgy. Eamon O'Cairgoin's studies on the cross at Ruddle likewise emphasize the centrality of crosses to the Paschal Triduum. A cross base on the Hoof, that's the top image here, echoes other promontory-situated cross bases across northern Northumbria. Here, I think most dramatically to that which was excavated at Aldhame, not far off. I have in the past argued that these monuments as much served practical function as beacons or signals at points of topographic transition as much as anything else. While some approach Lindisfarne by foot, we can imagine a great many more visitors would have come by water. Perhaps this monument served as a navigation aid through mist and rain, its coming into view marking entrance into sacred space. In some ways, I'd like to think of it as a sculptural vallum. Regularly traveling on the East Coast Rail Line is a reminder that even the Hoof's War Memorial can be seen from those tracks in all types of weather from miles away. I got to see it this morning. So we return to this assemblage. We don't know where any of these crosses actually stood on Holy Island. Acknowledging these gaps in our knowledge is, to my mind, as important as clinging onto the knowns and engaging in the guesswork. In all, Lindisfarne's burst of high cross investment occurs after that 793 date. This accords with the recent excavated human remains and small finds. Life was flourishing on island in the 9th and 10th centuries. A community remained on, one capable of patronizing and investing in the in vogue monument of these centuries, the High Cross. Through this, the community of Cuthbert, on and off island, participated in a wider insular tradition. High crosses were their sign of continued authority and influence in a changing world. With that, I'll remind you to stay tuned for the forthcoming excavation tome after next year's concluding season. Not right after, it'll take some years to write it up. And watch this space for more sculpture. So I'd like to thank you all again for the opportunity to be with you tonight. And if you have any additional questions or thoughts, please drop me a line over email. And I encourage you as well to check out the Dig Ventures page as recent finds are found. I mean, tomorrow is the end of the excavation. So not much more, hopefully. Well, we do live in hope always, but for our sake, perhaps not much more will be found. And then additionally, I know most of you will have some familiarity with the corpus of Anglo-Saxon stone sculpture based at Durham Uni, founded by Professor Dame Rosemary Cramp, who continued it. It has been a 40-year project, and in her passing, Professor Sarah Semple has continued on before Professor Cramp passed as well. So it's a mammoth database. It will be renewed with a new online presence in years to come, and it's a tremendous resource for this region in particular. Although because this region, the County Durham and Northumberland Volume 1 corpus volume was the first to be published in 1984. There are a lot of additions to be made to it, including our new Lindisfarne fragments. So my PhD updated at least the high crosses on that front. And then if you are on X or Twitter, if we still say that, the Corpus of Anglo-Saxon Stone Sculpture is on Twitter. I post to it when I can. And anyway, with that, just thank you again for allowing me to be with you today. And I look forward to any questions, thoughts, ideas that you have. Thank you.